Before we really delve into current youth ministry praxis and methodology over the course of the following videos, I feel that it is important to know a little bit about the development of adolescence and the history and progression of youth ministry. Knowing where we have been is essential for us to know where we are and need to head. Youth ministry and youth culture are fairly new developments in American history. Up until the early 1900s, agriculture was the dominant American lifestyle, and youth was just another term used for children. Education was not really emphasized, and anything that needed to be learned could be passed down. Children were expected to learn and ultimately take on adult responsibilities. There was very little transition from childhood to adulthood, and there was little need to recognize such a gap from childhood to adulthood. Once you were capable of taking on adult responsibilities, you were considered an adult. In 1904, everything changes. G. Stanley Hall coins the term adolescence in his book, stupendously titled Adolescence. He posited that there was a period of time where individuals struggled with some developmental issues prior to adulthood, what we know today as adolescence. Adolescence is defined as the period of life between puberty and a culture's expectation of adult-like engagement in culture at large. There are three main psychological developments that are taking place during adolescence, and they are important for youth ministers to be aware of. Adolescents are developing their identity, their autonomy, and their affinity. Identity, this is the who am I question. During this time, adolescents are discovering their personality, thinking abstractly, experiencing new emotions, and figuring out their value and belief structures. During autonomy, this is where adolescents are discovering their uniqueness. During this time, they are searching for their unique value and contribution to the greater society. In terms of affinity, almost contradictory to their autonomy, adolescents are looking for likenesses in others and the world around them in order to find where they fit in terms of relationship with others. These three concepts are definitely worth your further exploration in order to figure out additional implications for your youth ministry methodology. Now, adolescence is both a physiological and a cultural phenomenon. Adolescence is physiological because its initial markers are typically thought to be puberty and menarche. And adolescence is a cultural phenomenon as well. In the early 20th century, we see laws passed regarding child labor, removing children from the workforce. Emphasis as well is placed on education. During this time, children are required to go to school in a structured education system. Suddenly, there's sort of a holding pen that is created for youth, and in this time, youth culture begins to develop. The emergence of this phase and the development of youth culture are the result, again, of both physiology and culture. Hall's initial notion of demarcation still exists, but are radically different as physiological and cultural perceptions have shifted. The ages of adolescence have changed. Hall's original conception was that from 14 and a half years of age to, which is the onset of puberty, and then closed at 16 years of age, and you were an adult. So that's a year and a half to struggle with those issues. Well, just 60 years later, due to a number of factors, physiology and culture extend adolescence. At the low end, by physiology, puberty, due to hormones and steroids and food, gets sooner, maybe 13 years old. And at the end, culture determines that at 18, now you have 5 years to wrestle with those adolescent issues. And even currently, markers have changed substantially. Okay? This larger demographic and age range really created an opportunity for folks to engage in youth culture. Urbanization, which centralized the population, created a more dense grouping of adolescents practicing in this new youth culture. In this time, early 1960s, youth culture, as we know it, really begins to take root. We're talking cars, celebrities, music, fashion, and even their own language really set them apart from their adult counterparts. In fact, early youth ministers really considered themselves to be missionaries into an unknown culture. Adolescents experienced a loss of religious morals and faith due to the distractions of urban living. This was an unexpected exodus from religious faith that churches didn't know exactly how to combat. It is because of this new youth culture that youth ministry came into being. The church was not prepared or equipped to engage this new culture. A focused method of ministry was needed to reach these very different adolescents. Youth ministry was born. This new teen culture was marked by sin, which churches feared. Some legitimately was sin, but other things were just adults not fully understanding how to handle the new developments that youth were undergoing in this formation of youth culture. Most youth workers had to go outside the four walls of the church in order to meet youth culture right where it was. Let me give you a brief history of youth ministry methodology. Youth ministry has progressed through three major shifts in the last century or so. Mark Ostreicher suggests some key themes and cultural developments in his book, Youth Ministry 3.0, which has a short synopsis of youth ministry history that I'll summarize for you today. What he considers the first wave of youth ministry took place in the 1950s and 1960s. At this time, Mark sees youth culture really fixated on the development of identity. Youth culture was coming into its own, finding its place in the broader culture. Youth ministries, which were at this time mainly parachurch organizations like YMCA, Youth for Christ, Young Life, they focused their ministry on evangelism in an attempt to correct the wave of sinful behavior that accompanied this emerging youth culture. Their main method was proclamation, and preaching to youth became the sole methodology for youth ministry. Current and past tools and methods like small groups, curriculum, and more structured local church programs didn't really exist as we know them today. And while they sought to reach adolescents on their level, their preaching still carried the undertone that youth culture was a bad thing, and these youth need to be saved from it. The next wave of youth ministry took place from the 1970s through the end of the century. This is the type of youth ministry that most of my peers and myself were practitioners of. It is during this time frame that more traditionally thought of methods of youth ministry were being developed. Churches were developing programs beyond just a youth-oriented Sunday school class. And ultimately, this became both a positive and a negative force on youth ministry. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. The continued development of youth culture is critical for us to understand. During this time, youth culture has incredible momentum and spending power and really seeks to separate itself from the broader culture at large. Here's where we see youth culture as a movement really working the autonomy we talked about earlier. As a movement, youth culture becomes more countercultural and rebellious to the established culture at large. As the nation confirms and validates the identity of youth culture, now it is time for that culture to establish its uniqueness and separation from the culture at large. This autonomy, representative of youth culture, also drives the methods of youth ministry during this period. As youth culture seeks autonomy, so does youth ministry. Youth ministries became more program-driven, establishing youth-only services, events, prayer meetings, etc., effectively separating young people from the larger church body. While relationships are sincerely valued in this new model, numbers and methods become more valued than spiritual formation. Being relevant becomes trendy in order to attract adolescents with a facade that shares the autonomy that youth at this time so longed for. While this does not identify all youth ministries at this time, it is fairly true of much of Christianity. Some incredible strides in youth ministry resources and concepts were made during this time frame. However, a growing dependence on those resources marked youth ministers during this time, and more often than not, the method truly became the message. And for many, the trappings of youth ministry were more important than the actual message of Christ and the true spiritual formation of their young people. Now, programs are not bad. Youth ministry needs structure and mediums for spiritual and social formation. I believe in strong programs, but expectation that programs alone will contribute to a successful youth ministry is a very dangerous pitfall. Now we find ourselves in a third wave of youth ministry. And youth culture as a whole has shifted to its third task of affinity. Youth culture is the dominant culture, and for the most part, youth are the architects of culture's future developments. When you think about what young and old alike are listening to and wearing, we see that they are majorly influenced by youth culture. Majority of products and marketing are geared towards adolescents. Now, almost in contrast to its autonomy, youth culture is looking for likeness and belonging in others, regardless of age. Young people are looking to be a part of something bigger than themselves. This is one reason why we have seen such an explosion in social media, social justice movements, and missional living. They're asking the questions, where do I fit in this meta-narrative, and how can I and my tribe make an effective contribution? Again, youth ministry follows youth culture, moving from the cold methodology of the program-driven mindset to the much warmer concept of community and sincere relationships, not only with one another, but with God as well. Today's youth ministries are seeking to create true connections to God, like-minded believers, and missional kingdom living. Programs are still a quality tool in youth ministry, but now they are a refocused framework that doesn't supersede the actual message of Christ, but are structured to truly empower spiritual formation within community. Today's youth ministry models are doing a better job of striking the balance between structure and content to position adolescents for honest success in terms of spiritual growth and community. Over the next few sessions, we'll be looking at current methodologies and practical tools to create effective youth ministries in today's culture. No doubt how we lead and minister to youth will continue to morph as culture continues to develop and be nuanced. The important part of today's discussion is not necessarily the historical content, but the development of the understanding that youth ministry is rooted in a response to youth culture, and that youth culture is not static but fluid. And also, as youth ministers, it is our job to prioritize the spiritual formation of those in our care, knowing that we have the potential to shape a culture that is spirit-filled and faith-based. Good luck. God bless.